There is a strange moment that almost nobody notices while it is happening. It does not announce itself with an argument, a betrayal, or some unforgettable event that can be pointed to years later. It happens quietly, almost politely. One day the things you do begin to feel less like gifts and more like the background noise of someone else's life. The effort that once made someone stop and appreciate you slowly blends into the walls, becoming as ordinary as the air they breathe. Nothing about your behavior changes. You still care. You still notice. You still remember. Yet somehow the emotional weight of your presence begins to disappear. The cruelest part is that you continue believing your effort is being measured the same way it was in the beginning, never realizing that the human mind adapts much faster than the human heart. While you are investing more, the value attached to that investment is silently shrinking. People often believe appreciation disappears because people become selfish, but psychology reveals something far more unsettling. The brain is designed to normalize whatever remains consistently available. This adaptation keeps us from living in constant amazement over things that never leave. It is the same reason you stop noticing the ticking clock in a room or the feeling of clothes against your skin. Familiarity removes conscious attention. The tragedy is that this mechanism does not stop with objects. It quietly reshapes the way people experience other human beings. Someone who once felt extraordinary slowly becomes expected. Their kindness becomes routine. Their patience becomes predictable. Their sacrifices stop feeling like sacrifices because they are no longer compared against their absence. Instead of asking, "Look how much this person does for me," the mind begins asking, "Of course they do that. They always have." The invisible shift begins the moment effort loses uncertainty. In the early stages of any connection, every act carries emotional tension because nobody knows what tomorrow will look like. Every kindness feels intentional. Every moment together feels chosen. There is psychological energy inside unpredictability because uncertainty forces the mind to pay attention. Attention creates value. But once consistency becomes absolute, attention starts drifting elsewhere. The effort remains exactly the same while the emotional impact fades. The person giving more believes consistency proves love. The person receiving it unconsciously experiences consistency as permanence. Permanence eventually becomes expectation, and expectation quietly erases gratitude. This is why many people find themselves exhausted without understanding why. They are not tired because they have been rejected. They are tired because they are trapped inside a psychological illusion. Every additional act of care feels like it should restore the appreciation that has faded. They think the solution is simply more effort, more patience, more understanding, more availability. They keep adding emotional weight to a bridge that has already stopped supporting them. The heartbreaking irony is that increasing effort after appreciation has disappeared often accelerates the problem instead of solving it. The more predictable your devotion becomes, the less attention it demands. Human beings rarely evaluate value in isolation. They evaluate it through contrast. Light only feels bright because darkness exists. Warmth only feels comforting after cold. Silence makes music emotional because it interrupts noise. Relationships operate through the same hidden law. Presence gains emotional meaning because absence remains possible. When absence disappears completely, presence slowly loses definition. The person is still there, but psychologically they become part of the environment rather than part of conscious attention. It is not intentional cruelty. It is perceptual adaptation. The mind economizes attention by ignoring whatever seems guaranteed. This explains a painful mystery that countless people blame on themselves. They remember the beginning when every thoughtful action mattered. A small gesture once created deep emotion. Now enormous sacrifices barely receive acknowledgement. They assume they must have changed. They search for flaws inside themselves because the emotional response they receive no longer matches the emotional investment they make. But often nothing about them has deteriorated. What has changed is the psychology of familiarity. The emotional contrast that once magnified every effort has quietly dissolved, leaving the same actions emotionally flattened. There is another layer that makes this even more devastating. Once people unconsciously categorize someone as permanently available, they stop noticing what that person contributes and start noticing what they fail to provide. Appreciation transforms into expectation so gradually that neither person recognizes the transition. Instead of gratitude for everything that exists, attention shifts toward whatever feels temporarily missing. A single forgotten detail begins to outweigh years of consistent care. One moment of emotional distance overshadows hundreds of moments of emotional presence. Expectations grow faster than appreciation because expectations are fueled by habit, and habit constantly raises the baseline. This is why some of the kindest people eventually feel strangely unseen. They believe they are giving more than ever, yet emotionally they are receiving less than they did when they offered only fragments of themselves. Their effort has not become smaller. It has become invisible. Not because it disappeared, but because the human brain stopped registering it as exceptional. The extraordinary became ordinary simply by surviving long enough. Ironically, the people who care the deepest are often the most vulnerable to this process because they equate consistency with security. They fear that reducing effort, even temporarily, might communicate indifference. So they eliminate uncertainty entirely. They answer every emotional need before it is spoken. They anticipate disappointment before it appears. They become so dependable that they remove every psychological reminder that their presence is still a choice. Without realizing it, they erase the emotional contrast that once made their care unforgettable. Meanwhile, another invisible process unfolds beneath the surface. The receiving person does not consciously think, "I appreciate this less." Instead, they begin directing their attention toward novelty. This is not necessarily attraction to another person. It can be attraction to anything unpredictable. New experiences, new challenges, new emotions. The brain naturally chases changing stimuli because change signals information. Stability requires almost no cognitive resources. Novelty demands attention. When one person's effort becomes perfectly predictable, attention instinctively wanders elsewhere, even if affection still exists beneath the surface. That is why being taken for granted rarely feels dramatic. It feels confusing. Nothing obviously breaks. Conversations continue. Routines continue. Life appears functional. Yet something invisible has disappeared from the emotional atmosphere. You begin sensing that your presence no longer creates movement. You are no longer experienced as someone entering the room. You are experienced as part of the room itself. You become emotionally structural. Necessary, perhaps, but no longer consciously valued. People rarely celebrate the walls holding up the house until the walls begin to crack. Many people mistake this quiet fading for evidence that they simply need to become even more indispensable. They increase the emotional labor. They become more accommodating. They forgive faster. They ask for less. They hide disappointment so they do not create conflict. What they fail to recognize is that invisibility does not disappear by becoming larger. In fact, excessive visibility often produces the opposite effect when it lacks emotional contrast. Imagine hearing the same beautiful melody every minute of every day. Eventually the brain stops hearing music and starts hearing silence disguised as sound. The deepest pain arrives when effort becomes part of someone else's identity instead of your own. They stop viewing your kindness as something you choose and begin viewing it as something you simply are. Once effort becomes identity, withholding it no longer feels like losing a gift. It feels like you have malfunctioned. Instead of asking what happened to you, people begin wondering why you are acting differently. Your sacrifices become obligations without anyone consciously deciding they should. This transformation is subtle enough that both people often believe it happened naturally, when in reality it was built slowly through repetition. Psychologists often describe this as adaptation, but emotionally it feels closer to disappearance. You remember how your smallest actions once carried enormous emotional meaning. Now your largest gestures barely create a ripple. You start questioning reality itself. Was the appreciation ever genuine? Were those moments real? Or were they simply products of novelty? The answer is more uncomfortable than either possibility alone. The appreciation was real. So was the affection. But human perception is unstable. It constantly recalibrates what deserves attention. The more stable something becomes, the less attention it requires. Affection can survive that shift, but conscious appreciation often does not. There is a dangerous misunderstanding that grows inside people whose effort has become invisible. They begin believing love operates like mathematics. If 10 acts of kindness produced appreciation before, then 20 should produce twice as much. They unknowingly enter an emotional economy that no longer exists. Human relationships are not linear systems where increasing input guarantees increasing return. Past a certain point, additional effort suffers diminishing emotional impact because the mind has already classified it as expected. You cannot surprise someone with what they have unconsciously decided is guaranteed. This is why some people wake up one day feeling emotionally bankrupt despite giving everything they had. They were not investing in appreciation anymore. They were paying maintenance costs for expectations they never agreed to create. Every act of care simply preserved a standard that immediately disappeared into the background once fulfilled. The emotional reward never arrived because fulfillment only prevented disappointment. Success became invisible while failure became unforgettable. Perhaps the most haunting realization comes much later, long after the relationship, friendship, or connection has changed beyond recognition. You look back and realize there was never one defining mistake. No catastrophic decision destroyed everything. Instead, thousands of tiny acts of devotion quietly erased the contrast that made those acts meaningful. Your love did not disappear because it became weaker. It disappeared because it became constant enough for another mind to stop consciously seeing it. The same sunlight that nourishes life eventually becomes something people forget to notice until clouds arrive. This realization changes the way you remember the past. Suddenly moments that once felt confusing begin connecting together. The compliments slowly became assumptions. Gratitude slowly became routine. Requests quietly multiplied while acknowledgement quietly disappeared. You remember feeling strangely guilty whenever you wanted something for yourself because your role had shifted without your permission. You had unconsciously become the person whose emotional labor kept everything functioning. Nobody announced the role. Nobody assigned it. Yet somehow everyone adapted to it, including you. And perhaps that is the cruelest psychological truth of all. People rarely notice the weight carried by the person who never seems to put anything down. Consistency creates an illusion of effortlessness. If someone always remains patient, others stop imagining the patience required. If someone always understands, others stop considering the emotional work behind understanding. If someone always forgives, forgiveness begins looking automatic rather than costly. The more gracefully you carry emotional weight, the easier it becomes for others to forget that it is heavy. Eventually there comes a quiet moment when you recognize something that had been hidden beneath years of invisible effort. You were waiting for appreciation to return because you believed appreciation naturally follows sacrifice. But appreciation does not automatically grow from repetition. Repetition often erases awareness. Awareness is what gives effort emotional value in the first place. Without awareness, even extraordinary devotion fades into psychological wallpaper. Perhaps that is why the most painful losses are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes the deepest wound is realizing you slowly disappeared while standing in exactly the same place. You became so reliable that your reliability concealed itself. You gave so consistently that giving no longer looked like giving. You loved so steadily that love became mistaken for permanence rather than intention. By the time anyone noticed your absence, they were not mourning the countless invisible efforts that built the connection. They were only noticing the silence left behind after those efforts finally stopped. And maybe that silence is the only thing powerful enough to reveal what constant presence never could. Because effort becomes invisible long before it disappears, but absence has a way of outlining everything that invisible effort had been holding together all along. Only then does the empty space reveal the architecture that had quietly supported every ordinary day, reminding us that some of the greatest acts of love are recognized only after they are no longer there to be taken for granted. If this story felt less like a narration and more like a memory you never found words for, subscribe, because some truths are only visible after they've already changed the way you see your own life.